And I think that actually kicks off our call. Nicole, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. I'm Nicole Bivens Collinson. I work at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. I'm one of the managing principals and an operating committee member. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I've been doing trade for over 40 years now, unfortunately, when I start looking at how long it has been. And I'm very pleased. I've been involved in WIT, Women in International Trade, and by virtue, Organization of Women in International Trade, since I started in 1986. So I was one of the very, very first members ever of the organization. So very happy to be able to do an event that's sponsored both by WIT DC and OWIT International. And, we wanted to pull together a group to talk about what's going on and how things are shifting, or are they shifting, and just discuss what our thoughts are. And we're very pleased today that we have Ken Jacques, who's with us. He's a former a television media person, and he's going to lead us through our discussion. So maybe, Ken, you can get us going.
Well, thanks so much. Really appreciate everybody being here today. We got a great panel. These are some of the leading experts in the world on trade, and they know tariffs as well or better than anybody. And this is such a hot topic right now. It has been for a year and a half. There has been massive changes in the world economy because of tariffs, and we're going to discuss a lot of these issues today. I want to introduce the panel. Nicole, you introduce yourself. Noreen Burrows Cesario, she is the president of OWIT and also a principal at Market Accents. And Audrey Ross, a Canadian, she's a senior manager of customs and compliance at Innovative Beauty Group, and she's also with OWIT Toronto. Again, thanks to the panel. I think this is going to be great today. And what I wanted to start with is kind of give a 10,000-foot view of the topics we're going to talk about today. So obviously, global trade is clearly entering a new phase. It's not the status quo of what we've been used to for the last several decades. Tariffs are once again shaping economics, politics, supply chain, investment decisions around the world. Companies are dealing with higher costs, supply chain uncertainty, shifting sourcing strategies, and a growing pressure to rethink long-term planning, which I think is one of the main things that we'll talk about today. Consumers and populations in these countries are also feeling effects through inflation, pricing mechanisms, and economic uncertainty. And at the same time, countries are reassessing trade relationships, building new partnerships, creating new alliances, and exploring alternatives to longstanding trade structures and dependencies. We're also looking at a growing legal and political uncertainty around trade with a recent Supreme Court decision. And we're going to look at the possibility of refunds because of the massive amount of money that was taken in by the U.S. government through tariffs. So really the big question today is, are we looking at a short-term disruption, or is this a fundamental restructuring of the global trade system? So what I want to do, and having done a lot of these seminars, in the last several decades or so, what I want to do that's a little bit different from a normal panel discussion where you have one person talk for several minutes and another talk for another. I think everybody kind of gets bored with that. So I want to kind of think of it that you're watching a television show and we're at a panel. We want to get the conversation really going and talk about these things. I think we can get more out of it that way. And then at the end of the seminar, I want to turn over and do a Q&A with the audience. And I know you have a lot of great questions out there. So let's start with the broader landscape and what feels fundamentally different about global trade right now. And this question goes out to the entire panel. And so pick it up once I ask the question. What impacts are tariffs having not only on companies, but on broader populations and economies? Nicole, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Since the U.S. seems to be the primary offender of recent tariff changes, I am caveating that because I would say historically, The United States has been one of the lowest average tariff countries in the world. Our average tariff prior to the first Trump administration was between 1.8 and 2.4%, depending on whether or not you included special programs and FTA trade. So when you look around the world, the only country that had tariffs that were lower than ours on a consistent basis, and it was Hong Kong. Hong Kong had zero tariffs. And then Singapore eventually put them in. So you've got an economy that is a huge consumer of goods, which has been virtually open in many, many industries to outside producers and suppliers and manufacturers of these goods. And the World Trade Organization, I can remember in my infancy of my career, we were doing the Uruguay round negotiations and shifting from the GATT to the WTO. And part of that was an effort by the United States and those countries which agreed that they wanted to have world-based rules to try to manage trade flows better. And one of the elements of that was bringing down tariffs. And in that, every country put in place a commitment as to what their I guess band or upper level of tariffs would be. And so countries around the world have the ability, in many instances, to increase their tariffs from wherever they are currently being applied to up to 35%, 50%, whatever their commitment was whenever we set up the WTO. The United States, however, committed to binding its rates at its applied rate, and other countries have not. And now what we're seeing is the United States said, you know what? We've been committed to never increasing our tariffs above our bound rates at the WTO. For decades, other countries have not brought down their tariffs as we had anticipated they would as players in the world market. And so therefore, we're going to increase our tariff rates. Because we don't have the mechanisms to just do that, the Trump administration started using provisions that were given to it by Congress to increase the tariffs. And I think what we've seen is it's shaken up the world economies. It's shaken up many countries who for years, calling back on my days when I was in the US government as a negotiator, we were talking about some of these issues that they are still talking about today. And I've been out of government for 32 years. So that gives you an idea how long some of these conversations have been going on and nothing has changed. And now we see that suddenly countries are saying, okay, wait a minute. Let me think about changing my, sanitary or phytosanitary, or let me think about changing these other issues. So it has had, I think, a tremendous impact I'm starting at a country level, on the relationship between countries, between the United States and other countries. And I think that's reverberating on relationships among other countries outside of the United States. So I'll just kind of stop there, starting at the country level, and then maybe we can drill down further.
Yeah, I want to do a follow-up question to you, Nicole. You kind of talked about, you were there, you were a negotiator several years ago, and how things haven't changed that much, but yet they've changed dramatically at the same time, especially in the last 14 months or so. What has brought about this shift, and why has it been such a shock to the system?
So it wasn't a shock to my system. I can tell you that whenever Trump first put his Section 301 tariffs in place in 2018, I spoke at an event in New York. It was probably 6 months after the tariffs were put in place. There were 4 of us on the dais. The moderator asked, when do you think these tariffs are going to go away in a year? People stuck up their hands in 2 years, and stuck up their hands. And by the end of the Trump administration, stuck up their hands. And they're like, Nicole, you haven't said anything. I'm like, yeah, no. I said, this is a decades problem. There was just audible gasp. I said, there is no way these tariffs are going to go away. And I said, I don't care who the next administration is. No one is going to campaign on removing tariffs on China. I can only see it getting worse. And that is, what we saw. And so I think that, and then when the Biden administration was coming in after Trump won, there were a lot of people who thought, oh, the Democrats are going to get rid of it. I'm like, you guys are crazy. You're absolutely insane. What Trump did was actually more of Democrat than any Democrat had had the nerve to do. Democrats had been threatening, oh, you step across this line, I'm going to do this. And they never, ever did it. And then Trump came in and said, y'all stepped across the line. I'm putting the tariffs in place. So there's no way the Democrats are going to remove it. Now that we're in the Trump 2, I think what is really bringing the countries to the table is Trump said, all right, I put them in place. Biden left them in place. and we're 6 years later and you still haven't made any changes, that's it. As I compared it one time to a toddler that you tell them no, 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 and eventually you have to pop them, on the diaper, pop on the diaper to say, no, have I got your attention now? And I kind of feel that that's what's happening, and I think we've gotten some attention.
Interesting. So, and again, I want to get the other panelists involved, and this is kind of to get down on the micro level a little bit, but how are businesses adapting to the higher cost, uncertainty, and supply chain pressure? Noreen, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. It was interesting actually coming after Nicole. Let's just say that over the last year and a half, um, I have seen Tariffs 101 being featured on breakfast television as people started to grapple with tariffs. Or how is that going to hit me? And I don't think the UK audiences, and probably I imagine other audiences, we're talking of consumers, we're not talking of business people, actually ever really understood tariffs, how they work and how they actually impact either businesses in terms of the operations or the products and services that they're actually buying at the point either of retail or being delivered the services, although that's a different situation there and there. So I think it was a shock to the system because it was talked about. They were there. Everybody knew about the tariff situation, but they weren't expected. It wasn't told that this would actually happen. And when it did happen, I think it accelerated movement on a number of points that probably haven't really been discussed properly for years. So from that point of view, it's created a disruption in the market. And also, and you alluded to this, Nicole, it's not across all the sectors because it depends which sectors were more impacted by the tariffs, whether they were steel, whether they were the sanitary products or some food items. So different businesses, different sectors reacted in a different manner. Some of them were like, oh, okay, it's causing policy issues. I've got to consider what's going to happen long term, but ultimately it's not really hitting me at this point of contact today. Whereas others, immediately they started seeing the effects coming through. And that is why it was a much wider shock. So I think from a UK business perspective and supply chain and how this is moving along, I would say that the concern is a lot more about the volatility in the policy and what's happening, because all the frequent shifts in duties, and there have been a lot from today to tomorrow sometimes, and the exemption, it creates an uncertainty, and we do not like uncertainty. We never did. We're creatures of character. Our behaviors are what need to be adapted to go along with it. So they're making the long-term planning significantly harder. And they're also adding the pressure, which is ultimately driving and hitting the businesses, because we'd like to have a more stable and transparent trading environment so that there can be the planning for the growth. Because this is the other issue. I think most of the countries globally are all being hit by productivity issues and growth challenges. So it isn't something that just hits the UK or EU or Canada, you're there, Audrey, or, we're all grappling with situations within the economy where we have a lot of levers that can be actually pulled. So having the tariff lever pulled so drastically away from you, it shocked the others into action.
That's a good point. And from a Canadian perspective, Audrey, and Canadians have been the largest trading partner in the United States going back for forever, it seems like. What are you seeing on the ground there and how this is affecting businesses there?
I mean, I'll echo Noreen's sentiments too. Canada's a very cautious kind of investor. We're very risk adverse, and we live next to this neighbor that admirably like really supports entrepreneurship, really supports like dynamic kind of innovative ideas. And not to say Canadians can be very innovative in what they're doing, but there's such a culture of kind of cautiousness and pragmatism. So this kind of disruption is just like, it's very disruptive. It's culturally disruptive. It's sort of, emotionally and mentally disruptive. So that's where you see businesses have the most effect, where what they'd relied on for decades is sort of just shifting under their feet to the effect of like an earthquake.
Yeah.
So it's been that level of disruption, as Noreen mentioned, just huge. And I think what we have to consider, though, is that, you know, as Nicole mentioned, like these are decades long problems. And sometimes what we see is that in the policy, as a person from private business, maybe that's my biased view, but government and policy decisions tend to move so slowly, right? So we're all kind of accustomed to the pace of government and the pace of business can be very different. And then you have the cultural pace of entrepreneurship and disruptive concepts being faster than pragmatic long-term business thinking. And those are all just kind of coming into this conflict, which in some sense is interesting, right? It's interesting for us. And there's certainly opportunities. You see a lot of businesses who are in, you know, our field, like trade consulting. It's kind of like a silver lining to sort of a storm cloud of like, this is kind of an opportunity for us to, you know, make trade compliance sexy and interesting. But I think that is the, you know, when you're talking kind of about like long-term overview, how are we going to plan for this uncertainty? You're talking about many cultures that are very accustomed to business having one long-term planning. And in my day-to-day business, we do cosmetics. These are projects that are planned months out. So 125% tariff on an April 2nd or April 10th, when you can't change your vessel, you can't change the decision that you've made, and that decision was made 8 months ago. You know, for a business, that's just a hit. That's just a cost. And so businesses, I think, you know, even if we could disruption, yes, but maybe like a longer runway instead of a week, maybe a couple of months and 90 days, I think would be more, create a bit more certainty, at least for businesses to do that kind of, you know, 2, 3, 5 year planning that they're accustomed to, or for customers that are doing like 7, 8 month view orders to be able to react or plan for that, right? People, you know, making the decision to adjust your economy, to adjust your trade practices, that's, you know, that's what was voted for in the country. Like you can't step in and kind of dictate to another country how to organize themselves, but you know, certainly appreciating that a longer runway might be more beneficial to everybody adjusting and coming together and collaborating.
I agree that it's a really good point. And from what I've been hearing too, it's the uncertainty. This is the main thing. And because the changes in the tariff policy could change from week to week, and it has. And it really confuses people. You cannot plan around that at all. It's impossible to plan around that. And that's what's causing a major disruption, I think. Yeah, not only for Canadians, but Europeans, Africans, everywhere around the globe. And
And
I think that's,
Americans too.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. And like
Exactly.
Yeah.
I really worry about like OWIT often interacts a lot with small businesses, small to
Hmm.
medium SMBs in the US, SMEs in Canada. But like that, a disruption for a company like, you know, your big guys, like your Walmarts, your Home Depots,
Yeah.
your Selfridges, like they can kind of mitigate and manage those disruptions a little bit better. But, you know, a lot of the kind of concern is around even you know, American based, I think it was a toy company that kicked off the lawsuit on the tariffs, right? So these are small, like kind of mom and pop, you know, style or family style businesses that really feel those disruptions a bit harder than everybody else. And how can we kind of mitigate that risk for them as opposed to the global national players who are kind of accustomed to more disruption?
Well,
Yeah,
that's
and if I can
true.
come in there,
Yeah, go ahead.
Ken, sorry. I
Sure, go
think the
ahead.
cushioning of the shock is what is actually one of the topics we've actually been discussing quite a lot in the UK, especially for the smaller companies, because the larger companies tend to pass on the cost. And it's a matter of just, and I'll bring in here the topic of the supply chains. You know, in their opinion, we need to make the supply chains more resilient, and they just start building them in. The problem is that if you're a little cog in the wheel, cog in that supply chain, your resilience is being tested, sorely tested, because there's nothing to cushion you. You can't be passing on costs like that. You have to take those all in, absorb them, train, keep on taking people, plan your payee. And that is what I was talking about in terms of the whole disruption. it's an upending for the small businesses in a way that is not being felt, I think, so much by the larger companies. I've listened to the larger organizations, as you said, Audrey, the ones in wines and spirits, the ones in manufacturing. These are almost concerns that have gone straight to government. I've sat down with them and I've said, we've got to sort this out, and they're the ones that are having their concerns taken at a policy level, and whatever is coming through in terms of consideration, it's primarily there. It is not the cogs down the wheel, and that resilience in supply chain. And that I really am worried about that term that's being bandied about so much in the last almost month. We're all talking about it, and this will go across because the US is still in a lot of global supply chain. So whatever tariffs are being there, ultimately, small businesses will still be in those supply chains. And it's the shock, it's the cushioning that needs to be built in. I think that's the most important thing.
Nicole, what are you seeing from the US side? From especially with small businesses, what kind of impact is, because Doreen brought up a really good point, and so did Audrey on this matter. But what kind of impact is this having on them when they can't afford to pay the tariffs when it comes through customs? How is that reducing their production line? How is the supply chains being affected, and how is that really affecting the bottom line? Because it is inflationary.
Oh, it's huge. I would say we have our firm put in, excuse me, drafted an amicus brief in the Supreme Court challenge of the tariffs on behalf of We Pay the Tariffs. It was a group of over 700 micro businesses. Give me 1 second. My allergies. And so if you have a chance to read that brief, it's absolutely heartbreaking because you have stories of these people who said, I have 6 employees. We make $1.2 million a year. We are going to have to lay off all of these people. This is going to impact this. It's devastating as to what the impact has been on some of these small companies. And, you've heard, or you may have not have heard about some of the big banks. And I would say some that you might want to look at, investigate to learn a little bit more why I kind of raise my eyebrows, like Cantor Fitzgerald and Oppenheimer and JP Morgan. But some of those larger financial institutions who approached a lot of these smaller companies early on during this Supreme Court appeal process and offered to buy the potential for that refund for pennies on the dollar, 30 cents. I'll give you 30 cents for every dollar. Well, now there's still groups who are wanting to get that money, and they're offering 80 cents, 90 cents on the dollar that you'll get that money back. And so, the big companies can absolutely withstand this. The companies whose products have a wide margin, maybe it's a Louis Vuitton bag, or maybe it's a, Hag Sauer or whatever. I don't buy them. The big, really expensive watches, if those have that much cushion in there, so they're going to be able to withstand it. But when you're dealing with industries, for example, like the footwear industry or the apparel industry, which is pennies, their profit margins are pennies on an item. They don't have it. And a lot of those companies sold, if you will, their right to those refunds. And it's one of these things where, wherever there's an opportunity, someone is going to step in and they're going to take advantage of it. So unfortunately, it is the small, the medium, and especially the micro enterprises, because they were hit with a 1-2 punch. Remember, in that same proclamation that the president imposed those reciprocal tariffs that hit so many countries so hard, he also shut down the de minimis provision in the United States, which allowed you to import on a B2C, from a business to a customer perspective, one day, one shipment. If it's valued less than $800, you didn't have to provide really any data on entry, what kind of product it was, where it was. No duties were required. E-commerce was just taking off. It then exploded during COVID. And this is when everyone was able to use this de minimis provision. And we saw an explosion, a simultaneous explosion of a lot of micro enterprises, of people who got on the computers and found a way to make a business that if they could produce a t-shirt, you could tell them what you wanted on the t-shirt, they'd get it sent to you. This is somebody sitting in Rwanda who's getting a t-shirt from Bangladesh that gets it printed and sent to your house, and they get the money for it. Those are now being shut down. They've been shut down because they can't provide the data that they need to have. They can't provide certifications. They can't provide classification. They can't pay the duties on the product. So it was a 1-2 punch to the small, especially micro enterprises. And they are reeling from it. And the question is, from a US perspective, what's the government going to do about it? Are we worried about it? Are we so fixated on an industrial policy that you think, oh, well, don't worry that they had this little business that they could sit at home and do. I want them in a factory sewing that t-shirt. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I can tell you it's definitely been felt here, and it's also been felt by U.S. manufacturers who relied on critical inputs into the product. And then just to make it even worse, it's even hurting the big guys now because we have these additional Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum and copper and machinery and parts and components. So if I am trying to encourage my economy to industrialize, I want you to start producing the computer chips here. I want you to start producing the stereo equipment here. But the machinery hasn't been in the United States in the last 20 years because it was developed in Japan or it was developed in Europe. I need to allow them to bring in that machinery without having to pay these horrific steel or aluminum or copper tariffs. And there's no exceptions for that. So I'm just telling you, you must industrialize and produce in the United States, but anything you need, including the equipment to make it, I'm going to make it cost prohibitive. There are a lot of our companies, big companies, who had planned investments, hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in the United States as a result of the first actions, targeting especially China. But when the actions spread over to every country, they were making calculated decisions. It cost me like another 10% to move this from China to Bangladesh, but now Bangladesh has a 29% tariff. It's cheaper to produce back in China and pay that tariff. It just didn't make sense. So there's still questions and still potential that the administration might figure this out. If they do, then I think things might balance out a little bit more. But I think the question is, what do countries and companies do in the meantime?
And also like hitting the bad actors, right? Like, because Nicole, when some of your first comments, really like a government is looking at who is taking advantage, right? Especially that de minimis rule. What company, like there were micros, of course, but like what companies were taking advantage of that? And what kind of, in terms of some other regulations like the forced labor regulation and pieces like that, like who are the bad actors? And I think for maybe industry as well, it's a consideration of like, if I'm doing everything that I'm expected to and I'm being hyper compliant, I know what my supply chain is, I know what my tier Bs are, I know what my tier C is, I am declaring everything correctly, I am evaluating everything correctly, then what's the advantage for me, right? I'm doing all this work, putting all this effort into it, I'm doing everything that I'm expected to by US trade compliance. Or trade regulations, and then there's a lot of bad actors kind of not necessarily maybe facing consequence. So what's the advantage for a business to do the right thing, right? And I think that's where government, it can get very tricky to balance. Obviously, making a disruption, coming down hard on pain points that have been ongoing pain points, that makes sense for sure. That's totally fair, but when there are companies that are, doing their best to really keep on top of that trade compliance, how, to your point and to Noreen's, how can we kind of help those companies and especially those smaller ones level set so that they are being not rewarded, but just not punished for all of that work that they're doing?
Noreen, I want you to put your OWIT hat on for a second and talk about the importers in other countries, like in Africa and Asia. We don't obviously have them on the panel today, but when their countries, their governments raise their tariffs on our goods coming in, they obviously are going to pay it when it comes through customs. it has to have a massive impact on those companies that don't have the wherewithal as we do here in the United States or the UK or in Canada, that Nicole talked about, where some of these larger companies can kind of absorb that. But a lot of these countries can't, and companies in those countries can't. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's I will, and it's very interesting because ultimately we're changing behaviors and how the companies and the countries are behaving. And this does come down from the smallest companies, the smallest businesses. And let's put it this way, across a lot of our chapters, we have quite a range that goes from the micro businesses all the way up to the medium and larger businesses, and some a few even corporates, as you have there in the States. And they're looking around to near shore. They're looking around to change where they're getting their supplies from. They're looking around to change what they actually supply. So if it's changing the behaviors and what is being asked for as a demand. It's not there anymore. It's not pretty sorry, we can't get it. It's too expensive. Used to get medicines from somewhere, and now we're going to look and see where else we can get them. So we'll do without, or we'll produce our own. And the thing is, these aren't changes that happen overnight. You can't produce your own overnight, as you were saying, Nicole. It's taking time to restructure. So in the meantime, you do have a very disruptive environment. And this is why it goes back into saying that there's a lot of uncertainty. And where they can find alternative markets, alternative blocks. I mean, at the moment, there's a lot of conversations happening about looking to set up corridors where before they may have not considered them, adjacent neighbor corridors to avoid cutting down on some of the costs, maybe sourcing different components or sourcing different products, or even simply just going without. I mean, it's not a matter of, at the moment, if you got in a situation from a month to a month that your costs have gone up so much, you simply can't do it. It's putting you out of business. Once the business ceases, there's nothing to be bought. There's nobody to buy it or bring it in. It's a simple mathematic formula. So I think across the other regions, there's been also a lot more movement to try and see how they can create the business corridors through their trade deals. So we've got, if you look across Africa, there's the ACTFA, which has been helping to open up a lot of very necessary corridors just adjacent to each other, which weren't actually taking place, east to west. And it was about time these started moving off. So that they're focusing a lot more on regional rather than getting into those big global supply chains. And that is what I meant by the nearshoring. They're no longer looking at getting the products from the States or from Canada or from wherever. Canada is to be getting from there, I suppose. But if they can actually get it from across the region, they will then start building their own block. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the blocks come up. And I think this is probably very apparent even within a lot of, say, like the African chapters, which are beginning to work more together and to look at more trade corridors that they can open up between the countries. And I'm seeing that pattern actually across quite a number of our chapters, not just in Africa, because even in Europe, there's been a lot more looking at what else can we do within our own region? How can we build and get a sustainable, robust supply chain going here? And as always, I always say this, it creates innovation, because there's a situation where we need to sit down and really think hard about how can we make this work. And that is what is actually coming true in a lot of the other chapters.
Noreen, that's a great segue because we talked about this before we got on this panel discussion, is about the emerging trade blocks around the world and how
Yeah.
the old dynamic, the old paradigm of international trade is kind of shifting. And I want to throw this out. Are countries becoming less dependent on international trade relationships and alliances? What do we see moving forward? And Nicole, you had some really good points we talked about before we got on this call. Do you want to kind of address that a little bit? And then I want to talk about the Canadian perspective, because I know your prime minister has talked a lot about this in recent weeks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're starting to see is, the title of our panel is the magnetic north shifting. And heretofore, the holy grail of markets has been the US market. There was a time, I think, probably during the 90s and early 2000s, the aughts, that many companies global companies thought that the next holy grail of a consumer market was going to be China, but that didn't pan out. China basically said, please come to our country, invest, manufacture. You must transfer technology, and we'll give you 10% of our market. Unfortunately, they stole that technology. They stole the technology from the US, from Japan, from South Korea, from German companies, from Canadian companies, from everyone. And they use that technology to become the best in the world in manufacturing many, many products, which has then just basically subsumed all of the relevancy of the market access that that at least U.S. investors were trying to get into the Chinese market. So it's not the U.S. anymore because getting your stuff in there is so expensive. And if you can't get into the Chinese market because they're already producing goods that are way better than yours at cheaper prices, and they're making themselves for themselves, and they have so many non-tariff barriers that you can't get in anyway, where do you go? How do you trade? You have many of the countries over the last 3 decades that I've been doing this 4 decades. And in those 4 decades, we've seen more and more economies shifting to an export-focused economy. And as a result of that, they don't have the consumer base domestically, nor have they really identified alternative consumer bases for them. So I think that's where we're starting to see the shift. I think we're going to see more what I would call hub and spoke. And I can tell you that I've worked with some companies that saw this coming down the pike and were very prescient, and actually, because they had shifted to what they called a hub and spoke type of manufacturing, producing in Asia for Asia, producing in the Western Hemisphere for Western Hemisphere, producing in Africa and Europe for Africa and Europe and the Middle East. When COVID hit, they were able to very effectively shift into the different, as Asia shut down, they shifted production into their Western Hemisphere and their Africa. As the COVID hit over there, they shifted here, and they were not impacted so much. I think we're going to see more and more of that, looking and targeting smaller markets, and they're going to be more, I would say, what is that? Latitudinally, right? Is that the latitude or the longitude? I can't remember which one is which. Latitude or longitude? Anyway, they're going to be this way, up and down, north and south.
It's the vertical line.
It's the vertical line. Thank you. The
Yeah,
vertical.
I'm glad we're on a Zoom call because I actually could see you do this, so I know what you're talking about.
So, you're going to be producing in the Western Hemisphere for Canada, Mexico, US, Brazil. That's huge markets. If you put all those together, it's the largest trading bloc in the world. Okay, that would be it right there. Europe, working with Africa in those countries. Asia, working with the Asian sub-Asia continents. That's where I see that the things are going to start shifting into these smaller regional blocks, and that the approach of having global suppliers located in one location is going to go away. So I'm no longer going to manufacture everything in China and ship it to my markets in China, my market in the EU, my market in Brazil, my market in the United States. I'm going to shift manufacture in China for China. I'm going to shift manufacture in this hemisphere from Brazil and Canada and the US, and then I'm going to shift somewhere else. That's what I see is happening. And I think that that's kind of where some of the governments are now starting to see themselves. I've seen, like I say, I have worked with some companies that were doing this 12, 15 years ago and helping them to organize themselves in that structure. I think now we're seeing governments coming to the realization where I think it was you, Audrey, who said, countries are so slow when companies move like this, that adjustment period it's hard for them. They're used to the governments being slow, and now the governments are catching up to the companies who already saw some of this writing on the wall.
What about you from a Canadian perspective, Audrey? I mentioned earlier that your prime minister has talked a lot about this in recent weeks, about these changing alliances. What's going on there?
Mhm. I mean, to kind of tail end on Nicole's comment too, though, in Canada, sometimes the government has actually done some of the work, and the businesses haven't caught up, because here we have such a large neighbor and such a large market. So there's been a complacency that, if you look from a sort of a business mind or a productivity mind, there's been a complacency in Canadian businesses to simply export to their neighbor. who has similar legal system, same language,
Yep.
they're right next door. So that
It's
kind of
easy.
productivity, it's so easy. And it's maybe too easy, to Carney's point of like, we have all of our, the English saying, we have all of our eggs in one basket at this
Mhm.
point. And yet the Canadian government has done a ton of work over decades to get us free trade agreements. There's 15 free trade agreements globally that Canada has, which works out to about, covers about 51 countries between the different agreements. So those have been in place, and most of them aren't new. Like Indonesia, that's new. That just came in, kind of in 2026. The USMCA agreement, that's a 35-year agreement. We have CETA. We're celebrating, I think, 8 or 10 years with CETA, which is the Comprehensive European Trade Agreement, CPTPP. So those have been there. The government has been encouraging us to export, and just the momentum or trigger point hasn't really been there until very recently. And so I think Carney really is pushing for, and he's obviously he's celebrating about a year in being the prime minister. Had a notable impact at the Davos event earlier this year, and really spoke to kind of the key pieces, like how do you, as Canada has, although we're sort of in the G7, a wealthy country, we Noreen mentioned earlier, we're all facing productivity challenges, right? We're all facing this sort of push to innovate, to reconnect ourselves, and to relook at these relationships. And this, the tariff implementation, the sort of disruption that we've been talking about, is kind of a good lead off to that. But that's probably been necessary for longer. And his kind of vision is to get us to, if you are sort of this middle economy, to make sure that you're, staying on top of these agreements, staying on top of these relationships, re-looking at what the business flows are. To your point, Nicole, re-looking at, like, is it Brazil? Is that an opportunity for us that we haven't considered, or maybe haven't put some of the work into? So he talks a lot about that, strategic autonomy, sovereignty, and then sort of ending kind of this, everything with one relationship, right? Really pushing as well to the pragmatism, and sorting out these deals and policies in a way that creates the certainty that, of course, culturally we crave, but it seems that globally businesses do crave as well. And so that's been a big piece in his leadership, and sort of, obviously what Canadians businesses have been pushing for as well, but also with what support can we get to help us get into these new markets that are being made available.
This next question is kind of a segue to what we've been talking about. This is open to the entire panel, but is this a temporary adjustment, or after Trump leaves, do you think it'll come back to equilibrium? Is free trade dying? Is this the new paradigm as we move forward? What are we looking at here? Is this just kind of bump in the road, or is this long term? Nicole, you want to
I'll
start?
go
Oh,
next.
go ahead.
I'll go next. As Nicole said, and I think as Audrey said as well, there's been so much changes. This isn't a blip in the road. This has fundamentally rocked the way we do business. Is globalization dead? I hope not. Is it changing the way we look at it? Yes. And as we recognize more and increased and better sometimes trading blocks, which may suit us more at the moment due to the supply chains we're in, whether it's Commonwealth for us here in the UK, which is a very large trading bloc and opens up a lot of opportunities from Canada to Australia, New Zealand, Africa. It's massive and just as big as the rest of the blocks. We're talking about LATAM and America and Canada. So there's a lot for us more to play in, a lot for us to consider. And the trade agreements that are coming through, as you said, Audrey, I mean, we're delighted to join the CPTPP. That is obviously one that's still going to be reaping benefits. We've had our own free trade agreements come on board now as a fresh new trading nation after Brexit. And let us not forget putting Brexit on the road, because we've had our own stumbles and rocky starts after that. We've gone from being a big trading nation in our own right to being part of Europe, and then stepping out, and then refinding our own feet as an individual trading nation. And I see the blocks coming forward, and you see the appetite there is to actually sit down and talk and start looking at trade. So I think, yes, it has been disrupted. It's not going to be the same as it was. It will not go back to what it was, to your point, Nicole. I can't see them rolling back tariffs. If you've had some tariffs in place now, they may be tweaked, but they're not going to ever roll back. And it's up to the trading nations to actually sit down and work collaboratively together. At the end of the day, we want to trade. We all believe in exporting being the what will actually get us out of our economic situation, and that's going to be adding GDP and is going to be adding an opening opportunity. So why would we close the doors on international trade? We want to export more. If we want to export more, therefore we need to be speaking the same language and look at interoperability and look at the standards and look at the way we can actually work, because all these then do come online, as you were saying. If China's been producing products cheaply and maybe not up to scratch, and now is actually upping its products and they're still coming in cheaply, that is in direct competition with standards that have been put into place with a product that's going in at a much higher cost. So it definitely is one to be considered.
Nicole, what do you think?
Oh, we're not going back. This has been a fundamental change. When I advise my clients, I tell them that for the foreseeable future, there is no duty-free entry into the United States. There are some exceptions right now under the USMCA, but we are in the midst of an agreement review, which could result in eventually a 10% tariff just on anything. And the benefit is that you're USMCA partner. I don't know. But I think the whole concept really of free trade is gone for at least 2 decades. I think it's going to take that long for this to kind of get out of its system. It's going to take that long for any type of envisioned and reindustrialization that they'd like to see in the United States. It's going to take at least 20 years. At that point, then maybe they can be more globally competitive, and then they will start opening up from a tariff perspective again. But I don't see it happening anytime soon. I think it's eventually what's going to happen is the valuation of the dollar is going to change. I think that markets are eventually going to adjust. But I do think there's been some damage done reputationally because the U.S. has always been seen as the calm one, the good one, taking the high road. And at this point, I think we just decided, you know what, we're done. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to play the game the way others are playing it, and that's just the way it's going to be. And I think until we see some changes coming out of China, you're going to revert back to that tension. Some of you aren't old enough to remember this, but the tension that existed in the late 70s. There was always this great competition when we were transitioning from the GATT to the WTO. China was in accession discussions, and I can remember participating in some of those discussions. And at that point, everyone was very optimistic, and China seemed to be pointing to substantive changes within its structure, in the structure of its system, from a non-market economy to a market economy. 10 years later, once they were in the WTO, we saw a change in leadership, and there's been no looking back, and there's been no transition into more of a market-oriented, rule-following type of a player. It's until we see changes like that, I don't see the United States especially adjusting. And if the United States doesn't adjust, I don't see other countries following suit.
Audrey, what do you think?
No, I certainly agree. There's a lot of wishful thinking, especially in Canada, that for Canadian businesses, that it's a 4-year disruption. You just have to weather those 4 years, and you hear that from a few corners. But I think there's definitely a lot of business, maybe the majority, have the reality check, right? And that it really becomes, in a way, and in a way this is positive, it really becomes about competitiveness, right? Nicole, to your point, like we've kind of been maybe complacent or in some cases taken advantage of. And so this really leads businesses to really analyze, are you being competitive? Are you finding customers in the right places? Are you doing the work that, it's hard work to be an entrepreneur and to be a business. And are we kind of making those best decisions, or are we making easy decisions? And so I would say, yeah, this is a long-term thing that's going to change. I will remark that, a lot of the times when we talk about these free trade agreements, a lot of the times when, especially from government, but they talk about, we've made this agreement, we've taken tariffs down. And I work, my day to day is like either putting together a free trade agreement advantage so that we can get that duty preference, or coming up, determining an HS code in about 22 different countries to figure out what it is. Once tariffs are in place, that's easy. Like, that's the easy part. You've put 10% on something, you've put 20% on something. In Europe, they have VAT rates. You figure out the VAT rate. That's a percentage number that you can apply to your pricing. Ideally, it stays fairly static. It's not a yo-yo effect of the different rates. But the reality is, for a business, you can quantify a tariff rate. It's a percentage. It's 2%, 5%, 10%, whatever it is. You put that into your pricing. Where it gets harder, and Noreen mentioned this a bit earlier, and Nicole, phytosanitary. What are the requirements I have to meet? One of the challenges with Brexit, what are the new customs rules? They're redesigning their customs environment, and they want you to follow this form, that form, this agricultural requirement, that agricultural license. So where I think, especially small businesses and businesses can kind of see some or create their own stability, is that at least tariffs, it's a percentage. Once you've got it, you've got it. And it is focusing on the other challenges, and maybe it's encouraging the government to look at what are the policy or negotiation points around agricultural licenses, or whatever your sector industry is. Is it going to be battling out the steel to just get it to be a reduced amount instead of the 50, 75, 100% that it can be? So I think, even though, yes, we've just spent the last time talking about how disruptive it was, at least you can kind of lock in on that. And then, the next steps might be focusing on what are the big relationship differences if we're starting to talk to a new country or a new partner in a new country. What are the challenges that aren't tariff barriers, right? Because those do create an interesting challenge for businesses.
Nicole, who are the big winners and losers in this shift? We haven't talked about customers lately and individual buyers of goods and services, but I obviously would think that this is having a direct impact on them. But globally, who are the big winners and losers? Which industries can sustain this type of tariff regime? What industries are really hurt most by it?
I think if you look at the industries, it's going to be those with larger profit margins from a natural perspective. If you talk about food, generally raw food, does not have a big profit margin, right? You sell a bushel of corn for a set price, you're only going to get 12 eggs, no matter what you pay for it. There's certain limitations. Apparel is another very narrow margin. Footwear, narrow margin. Toys, narrow margin. But when you get into products, like computer equipment, small appliances, automotive, big industrial type products, or if you get into anything that's really a, what would you call it? Like avant-garde brands, things where that little knit cap that you're buying at Bergdorf Goldman for $405, you can go to Target and pay $1.50 and it's the same hat, but you're buying that name or you're buying that brand. Those are the ones that are going to survive. Those that have large profit margins built into either the name recognition, brand recognition, or into the product that they are manufacturing, where they can charge a much higher price for the product than what it actually costs to produce it. Computers, for example, it doesn't cost that much more to put, I'm going to show my ignorance, to put an extra gigabyte of memory into it. It does not cost you from a production perspective that much more, but I can charge you an additional $1,000 for that additional gigabyte of memory. So, those are the ones who are going to be able to win on a global basis. And I think that those things which are the lower profit margins are the ones that we're going to see relocating into the markets, like into the United States, or the markets that are being what I call being closed. So those are going to relocate. I don't know where the people power to produce those types of goods, because many of them are labor intensive, is going to come from. But, we're seeing crazy advances with robotics and, automation. So, part of the problem, I think it was Audrey, or I'm not, I think you mentioned, people becoming complacent, right? And that's what has happened to many US companies. And that's why you have seen that we've not reinvested. We've not expanded and exported. We've had a captive market. And so many companies have not exported, nor have they reinvested, right? They have taken that money and put it, oh, I might be able to get into the Chinese market. I might be able to get into the Mexican market, instead of putting that money back into the US and putting in state-of-the-art equipment. That's why they've lost competitiveness. And then they're like, well, I put that state-of-the-art equipment in Mexico and I put it in China, and it's going to be cheaper just to make it there and bring it in. So I'm going to close down my US facility. That's what happened. I mean, it was a lot of that happening. So I think if we even just take, for example, the steel tariffs that have gone in place and the aluminum tariffs that have gone in place, U.S. steel companies, in lieu of taking the win by knowing that they are more competitive and that people are going to be captive and selling at a lower price to the U.S. companies that were consuming it, they bumped their prices up above to the rates of the international prices. They took that money, stuck it in their pockets. They did not reinvest and start producing more. I have a client that got an exception in the first instance of the tariffs on a certain product, went to every U.S. steel mill, said, can you make this? Will you make it? They said, no, we're not going to make it. And they produced these products in the United States. They just needed the steel to produce them. And every one of them refused. Here we are, 8 years later, we're in this review of these tariffs that are on these products. And those steel companies have not started producing that. They knew they had a captive consumer that they would be able, if they made it, it would be bought, yet they still didn't do it. So there's a lot of blame to go around on some of the corporations for the situation that we're in and for causing this, I guess, pop on the bottom, as I like to say, that's happening in the internal place. And I think the ones who are going to win, like I say, are going to be those with larger profit margins, and that's the only ones.
Well, that gets back to my original point. It sounds very inflationary to me. Overall, you just mentioned the steel and aluminum especially, because there's so many products that have aluminum in it, and it's going to raise costs on everything. But you can say that about a lot of things. We're talking about the Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, and fertilizers and gas. It's just it really touches on so many aspects of the economy that makes things inflationary. So obviously, consumers, I think, worldwide are really hurt by this. But Noreen, and this question is for you, but how do you see the word globalization now? Because we've had this idea in the past, globalization is where, for example, Apple goes over to Asia, creates these factories to build because its labor costs are cheaper, so on and so forth. That's simplified, obviously. But now their protectionism in these tariffs are coming more and more in place. How do you see the term globalization kind of evolving?
It's a very interesting question, actually. Slightly loaded too. If you consider, I look at the UK and I look at the market here, and we've become, you were talking about the complacency, both of you, and I think, nowhere have I seen it more probably here. We hardly manufacture anything. Our manufacturing numbers are so low because we have specialized on services. We've pivoted. The whole economy had pivoted a number of years ago. So there wasn't the culture for manufacturing. It was easier to import assembly and just finish and sell and then re-export out. So Is that globalization? Because we're doing a rethink here that we need to start upping our manufacturing because we simply cannot afford to have such low levels of productivity. And there are things which are not available anymore. They are coming in too expensively on the market. The consumer is complaining. It's across the whole chain. So we are seeing that shift happen here. There is an element of nationalization, yes, because you want it to be a bit closer here and you want to have the quality. And if the quality is not there, then you're wondering why you're spending money importing items which could be better produced locally and be of higher standards that you actually want to buy. But then if the prices start coming up at being too expensive, which has happened already here, we've had the companies complain, I can't get my products to sell. I've got to go international because the local market doesn't want to pay these premium prices. They are looking for the cheaper price. And then you go back out into, oh, look at all the cheap imports coming out. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, really. And it's very hard to break that apart. Globalization, is not going to go away. Our trade agreements are there. We're all working towards getting more free trade agreements agreed, renewing what we have, making them better. So I don't see globalization moving away at all. Potentially rethinking how we actually get our products, our manufacturing in order, because we cannot afford to be just importing everything. I mean, you were talking about this, Nicole. It was actually very interesting because I was edging to just come in and ask you some more questions. You can build the factories and you can say, I'm going to build it here, but then how am I going to upskill the people to go and work in those factories, phasing them with automation and robotics? And will they be still doing those jobs? Or am I still going to end up in a service economy because that's all they're mostly doing? It's the whole thing could be placed anywhere because it's all robots. And it isn't really utilizing any human labor to get it out. And that is potentially where we're moving as well. So in terms of looking ahead and thinking, oh, I'm going to be building all these factories are going to be producing my furniture, my shoes, my clothes. Oh, who's going to work in them? Because I don't think there's going to be that many people eager to come out of university and say, I'm going to go and make a dress, because that's what I've really been waiting to go and do. So it is really forcing a big rethink, both in terms of how we're getting productivity levels up, how we continue exporting, and exporting is a big percentage of what every country will be looking at doing, but also exporting what we actually excel in. If as a country or product is manufacturing furniture, just because we're talking about manufacturing furniture, I want to continue having access to that. If I buy Scotch whiskey because I love my Scotch whiskey, then I want to continue having Scotch whiskey, regardless of the fact I can buy whiskey from anywhere. Really, because if you make it in your backyard, you can still buy it. If I like my French wine, why should I not be able to get my French wines? I mean, if I want to have my Dutch chocolate, I want that. And this is where it comes into that. Is that part of the full globalization we're looking at? That should still carry on. We shouldn't be competing with just trying to kill that market, because that is not the globalization I'm seeing. Interesting. I'd like to hear Nicole's and Audrey's opinions on that.
Yeah, Audrey, what do you think?
Oh no, I think that's so valid, right? Like that, and as a Canadian, I mean, we're never going to be able to produce bananas and avocados. But
No.
in Canada, we love bananas and avocados. So you have to be able to access them. We produce wine in British Columbia. It's very good, but yeah, you want that champagne from France. Like, so it's on the globalization scale, like this concept, or the economics of the competitive advantage, right? Putting your best products forward, right? Not just forcing people into these jobs that, like you say, Nicole, I don't want to sit in a factory sewing all day. I really like my kind of email job and my consulting kind of job. But also kind of, the risk sometimes with nationalism is that we build all these factories, we start producing all these things, and then they end up the same, and the consumer doesn't really have that custom choice to make the best decision, right? And then we can look at businesses, the complacency has been there, but also that, like, are you selling to a customer? Are you offering good service? Are you offering value for your product? Is it a good product, right? And I think there's been a bit of a sort of a misbalance or an imbalance, it's the English word, in what's been happening in the markets. And sometimes it's like, are are we having governments try to course correct in a way that's too much influence? You know, I think that's always the big human debate of like, are we having too much influence? Do we just need private to do this? And that's where this kind of discussion gets just very interesting, because we all know that we want to see an improvement. We all want to access the products that we like the best. But then how does that work so that, you know, to your point, Ken, like that there's a big reckoning, especially when we see robotics, AI coming in, the automation that's coming in. So what am I as a worker who in most countries we already feel like we don't get paid enough in wages. The minimum wage debate versus the living wage debate is a real debate. And it's not just real, it's people being homeless and people not having jobs, right? So there's this huge kind of break between those who are successful and those who are not successful, right? And how are we taking care of kind of our fellow, our neighbors, to make sure that this kind of disruption or this kind of imposition to business isn't such a negative effect, right? Because right now I feel like we're all in this, it's very negative. And you want to feel excited about innovation. You want to feel like, okay, humanity is taking the next step. Businesses are able to do this. I'm able to get a job. I'm able to make a living wage. And then right now it just feels like it's just maybe just in the mess of it, right? Nicole.
Yeah, Audrey, that's a good point.
I feel like you do, Audrey.
Yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about, and I don't want to get into it because we could spend another 2 hours talking about it, but is industrial policy, which is the other side of the coin on this. And, what are we going to do about this with AI coming into play? How are we going to train workers? What type of industries are going to really be out there for people to make money in? And from a U.S. perspective, we're really not focusing at all on industrial policy. And I think it should go hand in hand with the new trade policy, because it's really shifting dramatically. And this is very educational for me, because and I'm not a trade expert by any stretch, but I was thinking that this might be just kind of a bump in the road. But according to everybody on the panel, this is probably going to be long term, at least for another couple of decades. So I think industrial policy on the other side of the coin is going to be very important moving forward. One quick thing I want to get to before we go to questions, Q&A, and we haven't talked about it, and I wanted to talk about it, was the recent Supreme Court decision here in the United States, and the possibility of refunds and how that's going to impact the tariff regime. And Nicole, you probably know more about this than anybody here. You've probably been following it more than anybody. What do you have to say about that?
So, for just so everyone level set there, the IEEPA tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act imposed the tariffs that went up to 125% at one day on China. And they might be 45% one day and 20% the next day, or start off the morning at 10%, and by the evening they're at 25%. It just kind of depended on what day it was. But for a long time, and I think Noreen had said it, that it was a small toy company that challenged the legality of those using that authority to impose tariffs. That's the specificity. And the reason it was a small company is because the big companies didn't want to see a negative tweet by our president. And they were afraid if they challenged it, then he would say, don't go shop there because they're challenging me and my authority, and cancel culture is rampant here in this country. And so the challenge was, in the first instance, it was filed in two different courts, finally squared away that it belonged in the Court of International Trade. The Court of International Trade ruled they were illegal. You could not use that authority to impose tariffs, and commanded the government to stop collecting duties within 10 days. The government challenged it. It went to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. The Court of Appeals said, yep, it's illegal. You can't use this to impose tariffs. But hey, CIT, we want you to look kind of at your decision, because we're not sure you can apply it to take this one case and apply it to every single importer. Government challenged it again. Supreme Court looked at it, and in a 6-3 decision, and in this current makeup of our Supreme Court was very surprising, they said it's illegal. You can't use this authority to impose tariffs. And as a result, we're now in a phase where The courts have mandated that all refunds be given back. However, it's not being done automatically, which our customs service could absolutely do with a push of a button, but they are not. They put in a process, which there is a system. It's called there's an interface between importers and customs, and it's in one system. And they're telling every importer, you have to go into that system and pull out the data on all the entries that you entered, and then put that into a spreadsheet, and then give it back to me so I can put it back into the system that you just took it out of to verify that it was in the system. Now, why we got to do that, I don't know. But they've put it in place. They're kind of taking an 80-20 approach, which is this process we put in place is going to address about 80% of the entries. The other 20%, we'll get to it. They have reported to the courts that the first refunds should be in accounts by May the 11th. I can share that we had a client who received an early report saying that they would have money May 6th, but it's May 7th and they don't. So May 11th may come and they may not have it. And the Department of Justice actually has until June the 6th to appeal this. What happens? I get the question, what happens if they appeal it? How would they appeal it? They would, the issue of legal or illegal has been decided. The issue of this one case applies to every single import, that has not been decided. And that's where we think that they could challenge it. And there's potential that that could win. And so then it means every importer, instead of now, it should be that the customs should do it themselves. They should just refund it. The government should restore any illegally gotten goods and money. And they're not doing it. They're making you jump through hoops. If you don't know how to get into your account that I was talking about and interface with it, then you have to pay someone, pay me, pay a broker, pay someone else to help you do it. More costs to the small and micro enterprises. If the court loses this case about universality, applying this universally to all importers, then you're going to have to file in the Court of International Trade in order to get your money back on an individual basis. More costs. So, it's burdensome, it's onerous. I think we have seen some legislation introduced by Congress saying that it should be automatic. I don't think it's going to move until we see whether or not money starts going in pockets. If money starts going in pockets, then they'll back off the legislation. If money doesn't go in pockets, we could see that legislation moving forward because so many people are complaining. And then we've got further problems where class action suits are being filed against certain companies saying, you're getting a refund, you charge me more money, I want some of that refund. So, even though you think you might be getting some of the money back, you might have to figure out a way to help the consumer who feels they were hurt. It's not over yet, but we're a lot further along than we were before. There's still legal challenges right now on the first Trump 301 tariffs on China. That's still pending. The Supreme Court may be taking that up this summer. There is a pending challenge on the Section 122 tariffs right now that could deem that you can't use that authority, as the president has done, just to replace the IEEPA tariffs. There's a challenge on the 232 tariffs that have been put in place and how they're being done. So all of the actions are still being challenged. We could find ourselves in a refund situation as we are with the IEEPA tariffs. But we'll see.
And Nicole, there was also a larger constitutional question that I think we should talk about just for a minute because I want to go to question and answer. But it's over separation of powers and Congress's role to raise money into tax. And one of the arguments on the groups that were bringing this suit is that tariffs are a tax. And I think that was one of the things that they really ruled on. And I think that's very important that it really can't be overlooked.
Yeah, I think it's Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution says that Congress is the one who has the authority. It's just that Congress has delegated in certain instances under that's why you hear the certain sections, Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act, Section 307 of the 1930 Tariff Act. Section 232 of the 1974 Trade Act. Each of those sections Congress has given that authority to the president, and that's what's going to be challenged.
Exactly.
Yeah, and as far as separation right now, there's not a whole lot of separation
Not
of
a
anything.
lot. No. And if you don't live in the United States, it's kind of interesting to watch, to say the least.
But even as an outsider, like you're kind of looking at, obviously the imposition of tariffs or changing the economic policy is the right of every government. But I think it was interesting for people who are accustomed to the state of law or the way checks and balances work in the U.S. to see, like, the fact that IEPA was pulled forward as the justification, and so to see that sort of
Yeah.
rebalanced is, I think, has been a positive sign for understanding, like, or appreciating the rule of law, because that was a bit of a concern as well, and added to the uncertainty of, like,
Yeah.
if they aren't sorting out how their regulations are
Yeah.
arranged and organized.
Another panel topic, rule of law.
That huge topic, yeah. But also, don't worry, I'm an ACE super user now. I'm in the ACE portal. I'm doing the CAPE refunds. So if a small business is on here and they want to connect about how to do that, I've had to go through the gamut of getting access to that for a non-resident business, for a resident business. So if I can do it, you can do it too.
Audrey, you've just talked yourself into a masterclass there. Be careful. We'll pick you up on it.
Let's get to some questions and answers. Noreen, since you were, I think you created the Zoom. Do you see any questions that have popped up? And if
Yes,
not,
we do.
Please, anyone with questions, come online and ask our panel, and we can.
They won't be able to speak. I need to know that they have a question to give them voice.
Gotcha.
But I think what we'll do, shall we open the Q&A box, because there's two questions there.
Okay.
And the first one is, what can OWIT do to help its SME members adjust to all the disruption and survive? Susan Baca was asking that question, and she also has a follow-up question, which is, what policy reforms should governments make to modernize trade frameworks that will help SMEs to navigate an increasingly complex global market? Shall we open the floor and just comment on all of them? I mean, we're all OWIT. And kick off the OWIT conversation, seeing I'm in the president's role, because I think that's another loaded question. I think organizations like us, and we are pushing ourselves in that position more, we can actually play a very practical role, passing on knowledge, interpreting it like we're actually doing on this call, being the voice at the table, having the visibility so that we can actually be consulted on new policy that's coming out, or policy reviews, or new trade agreements. These are all very valuable ways that I think OWIT has a role in actually participating within the new global trade environment that we find ourselves in. As we said before, some of the biggest challenges we have is the uncertainty in the market, the lack of knowledge, the lack of being able to move swiftly sometimes in face of having to pivot. So being within the network, and probably we should be able to make better use of this, is make use of the full global network we're in, because we've got chapters across the continents, chapters across the blocks we were talking about before, Nicole, even when you were talking about the Canada, the Americas, the Latin area, the Africa, Europe. So we should be making better use of all this global connectivity we have, the knowledge banks we have there, the fonts actually of expertise in certain areas that can help us to actually quickly get to grips with whatever's coming along. And let's put it this way, as we all said, this is not the end. It's here to stay. The global chaos will continue, and we're all in roles, running businesses and participating in professional lives in a way that needs to carry on. Susan, I'm not sure that actually answered your question. I'm now going to pass on to both Audrey and Nicole to give their own insights on what we can do as OWIT.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, Susan's in my chapter in the long term, and I think she got her chapter started back in the day. So Susan's a longtime OWIT member, and so certainly a woman I admire and I'm lucky to work with. But I think some of the things that what Toronto does well, right, is we try our best to keep a really robust event calendar, and not just of our own events, because obviously we're all volunteers first, so it can be challenging to put on our own events all the time and through the month. But I think, using a tool like the event calendar and keeping that, getting the feedback from, in Canada, we have a few, Export Development Canada or the Global Affairs Department, and posting those events, sharing the other events that are going on, in the other chapters, making sure that our members are aware that those are happening, I think is, it seems like a small thing, but it is the way to kind of get that info sharing. And then doing that networking and making sure we're doing those introductions, right? To let people know, and then the membership success stories, right? To highlight members who have done a success. So we had one of our members recently, she'd been trying to get into Mexico for years. I mean, I think she's been trying for years, and she kind of finally figured out, she got the right connection, made the right introduction, got the right agent, and was able to turn it into a success and start exporting there. So even highlighting those stories to other entrepreneurs and to other members, so that we see like other women businesses being successful, and that are not huge businesses, that are not, the big people, but just the learning how they've made those endeavors and efforts too. So yeah, event calendar, the networking, and then the success stories.
And Nicole, what about you?
I agree. I mean, I don't know that I have any other, part of it is there's something, I mean, I don't want to self-promote, but I do produce a 2 Minutes in Trade podcast that any podcast you go to, type in 2 Minutes in Trade and you can listen to it. And I try to do it, maybe takes 3 minutes with the intro and the outro. But it just quick snippet of what's a big issue or things that are going on. I try to keep it to facts. Sometimes it gets a little opinionated, but that just happens. That's human nature. And again, it's free. Our firm does do a daily international trade newsletter that focuses only on the United States. But if your target market is the United States, it's going to tell you, is there a new anti-dumping countervailing duty? Is there a new law? Is there a new tariff? And that's free. It's 100% free, no obligations, just, that. But finding news sources, things that give you that information on a timely, updated basis. There's Trade Guys is another one, I think, that's out there. That's Chad Bown, I think, and Enoch. What's her last name? Enoch starts with an M.
Trade Talks. It's Chad Bown.
Enoch starts with an M, right? Can't remember. Sorry. We will find it. But that's another podcast that you can listen to. There's different organizations that are really involved. Whether it's the international, USCIB, the International Council on Business. That's another good one to get on their mailing list to see what's going on. It's trying to stay informed. That's really it.
And that's the richness that comes from OWIT. And I think we need to capture such insights and tips and get better engagement between the chapter members as well. So that's something, Ken, we should try to push towards, making sure we've got more visibility of what actually is out there amongst our members.
Yeah. Susan had another good question. What policy reforms should governments make to modernize trade frameworks that will help SMEs to navigate an increasingly complex global market? And I know we talked about this a little bit, but if you can get kind of down in the weeds just a little bit more, I think that might be able to answer her question. You want to start with that one, Noreen?
Well, yeah, I think I would just say continue pushing on digitization, although I'm one of those that was actually complaining. Sometimes it's a pain when it actually starts coming into practice until you get to grips with it, but then it runs, and it does. It's one of those levers that can actually help and assist in the situation. And it's actually looking at how to make it more usable, more predictable, because we really need to have that uncertainty taken out of the equation in as much as they can, and also much more digital, just to give us better access across I think those are fundamental, really, in terms of what they should be doing, because all the custom procedures, all the documentation we have, all the regulations, all the jurisdictions, it's just opening up a whole Pandora's box when you're starting to work with them. They need to be simplified, and that would be the first step. And then the digitization does come along, as does the usability and the predictability, because you're actually, even from that simple process, in a better position to have predictability at your fingertips.
And
We got
tools like
5 minutes.
the,
Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry,
I'm sorry.
tools like those digital passport products too, where like,
Yeah.
you know, for a private business, for governments to look at your products earlier in the process instead of at the import piece. So things that, to your point, that standardize what's expected, that in those trade relationships when you're negotiating with another country, trying to get on the same simplification of what you're expecting from businesses to do at the import side, and then also trying to move that, what do you want to know about my product before it gets to your country, and how early can I present that private business perspective.
We got about 5 minutes left or so, and we got one more question. I want to get to that, and then I want a closing statement by all the panelists, because it's been phenomenal. I've learned so much, and I've really enjoyed doing it. But Aziz asked, how would you reform the current tariff system to reduce pressure on global trade and supply chains? Nicole, you want to try to answer that one?
So I'm going to kind of not answer it and answer it in a different way, which is I've worked with a lot of companies, and I think I said this earlier, who said that if you could eliminate the non-tariff barriers to my products into the global markets, I can compete. The tariffs are not going to matter to me. But where I cannot compete is on the non-tariff barriers. And that's what the United States puts out, this NTE report, which is the National Trade Estimates report, and does a country report card identifying all of the non-tariff barriers that are problems. And what they've been doing in all of these discussions, these ARTs, these agreement on reciprocal tariffs that they've put in place with 8 countries so far and have frameworks with another 7 or 8 countries, is they've gone through, if you look at the agreement, they've gone through in almost paragraph by paragraph from the NTE report. They've addressed how the country is going to do it and the commitments that the country has made to resolve these non-tariff barriers. Like I say, most of my companies have said, get rid of those and I can compete, and tariffs don't matter.
And I agree with you on that, because I think there's too many of them, and it runs across in every country and every jurisdiction.
Yeah. Third, I agree.
Yeah, we're all agreeing.
All right.
Yeah, and also keep tariffs stable. Like pick a tariff, run
Yeah.
with it, change it annually.
Exactly.
Allow the businesses who want the exception to give the feedback. I think that's a success model for every country. But yeah, keep that if you keep it stable, then I'm like, yeah, 10% added in, no problem, good to go.
Yeah, I've got predictability. I've got usability. It
Yeah.
just
All
keeps
right.
on going around.
One question I always close with, and I had a podcast a few years ago. And by the way, Nicole, that's one of the funnest things I've ever done, was doing a podcast. You mentioned yours.
2 minutes, I'm done.
But one, I always close out by asking, are you an optimist or pessimist? And that'll be your closing statement. So I'm going to go around the room and start with you, Nicole. Are you an optimist or pessimist?
I'm always an optimist. I always am. It's just my nature. I believe there's yes. I believe you can always get to yes. It's just you've got to find how to get there. So I am an optimist. I think that eventually the markets are going to adjust. As I said, I think currencies are going to adjust. I think sourcing frameworks and structures will adjust. It's going to, I mean, it was pain. Think about the 80s and the 90s, how painful it was, how we saw I'm speaking from a US perspective, but in the US, we saw this just absolute, as a former presidential candidate said, a giant sucking sound of jobs that were lost in the United States as companies moved overseas and started producing elsewhere. That was painful. And we're in that painful process. But I mean, if you look at where we were back in the 80s to where we are today in 2026, it's like we were booming, we were doing great. We're going through that adjustment period again. And I think at the end of the day, 10 years from now, I'm hopeful. I think things are going to be better.
Noreen, what about you? Optimist or pessimist?
Pragmatic optimist.
That's a good twist.
Very optimist with pragmatism thrown in.
Okay, explain
I
why.
have to be. In the world we're in, I echo what Nicole said. Hopefully, in 10 years' time, we will have a much more improved situation. We'll all be moving there. Everybody wants to have a better situation. I don't think anybody wants to be in a
No.
negative world. It would drive us all crazy. Audrey, what about you?
Well, Canadians are always optimistic, so I think I know the
Always.
answer.
I'm with Prime Minister Mark Carney. It's a principled and pragmatic approach that we're going for, but definitely optimistic. I think from my kind of personal private business perspective, when you think about, obviously these are some challenges, they're disruptive, but there can be huge opportunity in that. And I think businesses, private businesses, small businesses, micro businesses have an opportunity to see those, see an opportunity, see what the white space is, see where the gap is. There's obviously knowledge gaps in tariffs. That's huge for trade compliance people. There are, the government needs more feedback now more than ever. So then there's an opportunity for consulting. There's industry associations. So I think, there's new customers potentially, right? You're finding a new market. Who's your new customer? Not everybody wants maple syrup. But there are some people who do. So what does that look like, right? So I'm with Noreen, pragmatist, but also optimist.
Well, with that happy note, I want to thank everybody for attending. The panel was fantastic. I learned a lot, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I want to turn it over to Noreen. She set up the Zoom call. Thank you so much for doing that. And to WIT DC, who put together event. And Judy, I know you're in the crowd. Thanks for your leadership on this. This was a really, really good discussion, and hope we can do some more like this. And again, I enjoyed it, and hope everybody did as well. So, bye for me.
Oh,
Noreen,
you're on mute.
Noreen, you're on mute.
Yep,
There you
I've
go.
muted myself. I'll just add, if you're with us and you're not an OWIT member, please do join us. Come and speak to us. Go to owit.org. I will be delighted to carry on the conversation. And thank you to all the OWIT members who are on the call. Susan, we see you, we hear you in a very big way. So thank you all and goodbye.
Bye bye.